Thanksgiving meals can be stressful, but they don't have to be. In this video, I'm going to show you a chronological way of organizing your Thanksgiving meal with make-ahead dishes and lots of fresh vegetables and fresh flavors. You'll find a full description of everything that I did down below in the description box, as well as a grocery shopping list of everything that you need for this succulent meal. For comfort and for convenience, make sure you clear off a space so that you can prep on this surface and not have to worry about clutter. Let's start off with my favorite part about Thanksgiving, stuffing. All you need is a good loaf of bread. I like to use this rye rustic bread. I cut it in half because I'll only be using half for the stuffing. At this point, you can choose to cut or tear your bread. I kind of made a hybrid of the two where I sliced the bread into uniform inch-thick pieces, and then I hand tore each individual slice into various shapes. I just think that this makes the slices have those irregularities while still all being more or less the same size so that they'll cook evenly. My favorite part about stuffing is that there are those crispy, crunchy pieces mixed in with the mushy, broth-soaked pieces. So if you like that as well, you can also try to make it more jagged, have some bread pieces sticking out here and there, and that will definitely crisp up well in the oven. You can do this a couple days ahead of time and just leave the bread out on the tray that it's going to be baked in or on a baking tray and just let the bread dry out. The drier the better, because then it'll be able to soak up all of that flavor in the broth that you'll be pouring over it later on. What you can also make several days ahead of time is pie crust. I'll be making a pumpkin pecan pie and an apple pie, so let's make the crust for the pecan pie first. I'm following a Bon Appetit recipe which calls for rye flour, but you can obviously replace that with all-purpose or just any flour you have on hand. I'm using a food processor, but you could just as easily do this by hand. We're also prepping a glass of ice water, which we'll be using later on. You'll want to make sure that all of the dry ingredients are fully incorporated before you add the butter or the ice water. Now take your butter out of the fridge and make sure it's still cold. I like to just weigh it out in the wrapper that it came in because this just cuts down on the amount of dishes that I have to do, which is always a plus for me. The size of your butter cubes is a preference thing. Some people like them to be irregular, some people like them uniform. Just cut them to however big you want them to and toss them either into the food processor or you can massage them in with your fingers. I processed it for under 10 seconds, then stopped to look at the butter texture and noticed that it was still really dry. So I added in some of that ice water and slowly incorporated that into the mixture. Keep a close eye on the dough as you're adding the water because you just want to add enough to get the dough to come together and not to soak it. At this point, I poured it into a mixing bowl and just used my fingers to form all of the crumbs together to form a cohesive dough. And this will be wrapped up in some plastic wrap and chilled in the fridge until it's ready to bake. Remember to put it in the fridge for at least 30 minutes, if not longer, and this can hold for up to 3 days. Now is also the time to make the dough for the second pie, a classic American apple pie. We'll only be using all-purpose flour for this one, and same method, same food processor, combine all of the dry ingredients and measure out your butter. This is the exact texture it's supposed to be. It's supposed to look crumbly, but when you squish it together, it forms into a dough. Once again, you'll want to combine it all together, making sure not to knead too much, and wrap it in some plastic wrap. Alright, so now that that is chilling, we can go ahead and prep our veggies. This will definitely take the longest amount of time, but it's so worth it to prep everything all at once. So here I am pulling out everything I want to prep, including green beans, Brussels sprouts, carrots, celery, zucchini, potatoes, as well as mushrooms, onions, and garlic. Go ahead and wash your Brussels sprouts first. We'll just be cutting off those hard, tough ends and cutting them in half. I'm putting them in a Tupperware container because I'll be salting them and leaving them in the fridge overnight. Once you're done, generously season with sea salt, put on the lid, and give it a good shake. For all of the vegetable scraps, it's good to grab that big bowl that you were using earlier and throw everything in there. You'll definitely be filling it up by the end of all of this, and you can use it to make a beautiful vegetable stock or to compost. Now I'm just washing, peeling, and cutting the ends off of these carrots. We'll be using this as a basis for the duck that we'll be roasting later on. In order to slice these carrots, I got my trusty Chinese cleaver out because it's just the sharpest knife that I have. I'm just going to cut these carrots in a diagonal at a slight angle just because they look pretty and they roast evenly. The zucchini will go into the same roasting tray, so I'm just going to cut off the ends and then cut them into relatively thick pieces. We just need a little bit of celery for the stuffing, so I got 2 stalks. I am cutting off the ends and then cutting them in half and then slicing them lengthwise. This just makes it easier to dice it into tiny little cubes because we just need it for flavor. We don't want them to overpower the dish. Store this in another Tupperware container so that it'll be ready once you start cooking. The green beans have been washed, and now I'm just checking to see if they're stringy at all, because if they are, then I'll have to remove the ends with my hand, and because they weren't, I ended up just using scissors. You can also use the same knife that you were using all of this time. Again, throw all of your scraps into this massive bowl because it makes cleanup so much easier later on. Alright, now for the garlic. I prepped way too much. I don't think that you need 2 full bulbs, but go ahead and remove the skin off of the cloves. I like to just use my knife to flatten the cloves so that the skin comes off more easily. I also recommend doing this a couple days ahead of time, especially if you're going to be throwing a party, because you will smell like garlic afterwards. Make sure to wash with lemon or with stainless steel so that you can remove as much of the odor as possible. You'll want to then finely dice your garlic and store it in a container. This will also hold really well in the freezer, so you can also prep ahead of time. Next, you'll want to prep some onions for that extra flavor. Again, I prepped way too much, but here I'm just cutting off the skin, and I'll be using my food processor to dice this because honestly, I'm not in the mood to cry right now. And once again, I'm storing it in a Tupperware for later use. Alright, the mushrooms are basically the centerpiece for the sauce of the bean casserole, and once again, since the food processor is already dirty, I have this slicing mechanism right on it, and I'm using the food processor to slice all of these mushrooms. I washed the containers that the mushrooms came in, and that's how I'll be storing them until I use them. Perfect, so now we can start cooking. Go ahead and bring a pot of water to a boil. We're going to be pre-cooking the macaroni so that it bakes faster later on. And at the same time, you can also blanch your green beans. Just balance your sieve and cover it with a lid. That's boiling away. We can roll out the pumpkin pie pastry that should have chilled for at least 30 minutes by now. This will then go into the pie form and we'll have to chill it again. Make sure to flour the surface and your rolling pin liberally. I like to put a square piece of parchment paper inside the pie form because this gives it corners to lift your pie out when the time comes. Go in so that it lines the edges and then cut off the excess dough. This is also a good time to crimp your edges or to use a fork to make imprints. At this point, go and check on your macaroni and green beans. The macaroni should be al dente, and you can take it out and drain it. Let it cool in the tray that you'll be baking it in because this will save up on dishes and it'll also clear up the pot for later on. Alrighty, now we can make our pumpkin pie filling, which can also be made way in advance. Go ahead and crack 2 eggs and 1 egg yolk into the food processor. Again, if you're not using a food processor, you can also use an immersion blender or a regular blender, or simply just mash it by hand. Now I'm pouring in some heavy cream. These are all of the spices that you'll need. The next ingredient is melted butter. As you can see, it's not completely melted, but that was totally fine. So I live in Germany and it's really hard to find canned pumpkin filling, so I just roasted my own pumpkin and pureed it. But obviously if you have access to a can, go ahead and use that. Blend it all together and then set it aside until later. Now we can use the same pot that we cooked the macaroni in to make the sauce for it. Start off with a knob of butter and melt it down until it's liquid, then pour in 2 tablespoons of flour and make sure to incorporate that so that there aren't any lumps. To be honest, I didn't follow a recipe for this, but it totally worked out fine. You can also use a whisk if you think that that incorporates the flour better into the butter. Then just go ahead and pour in some milk and make sure everything is incorporated and lump-free. As this mixture simmers and cooks, it will begin to thicken and form this luxurious sauce, which you can also season with whatever herbs you want. I use thyme, rosemary, Italian herbs, and paprika, and some garlic powder. And remember salt and pepper as well. To test if your sauce is ready, you can just swipe the back of the spoon that you're using to mix the mixture, and if a line holds, then it should be ready. At this stage, I added some Parmesan, some cheddar, and some Gouda, just to give that extra cheesiness. Alright, now preheat your oven to 200 degrees Celsius because it's time to bake. The first thing going in will be this pie crust, which I again topped with some parchment paper, weighed it down with some beans, and then put it in the oven for around 20 to 30 minutes. To further dry out your bread, you'll want to pour it onto a baking tray and put it again in the oven for around 20 minutes until it's completely crisp and dry. At this stage, you can also put the potatoes in there on the same baking tray or not, up to you. These are going to be the basis of our twice baked potatoes, so this is the first bake and you'll want to just coat it with some olive oil. I actually ended up baking these potatoes for around 40 minutes, so just beware. While I was waiting, I prepared this other component to my mac and cheese, which I always do, where I just blended some boiled carrots, and this just adds extra veggies to your mac and cheese and adds some color and just brings volume to the sauce, and I really like that tip. Once your bechamel has cooled, you can assemble your mac and cheese. A mixing bowl is obviously easiest, but you can also do it in the tray that you're going to be baking it in. Just mix everything together. It can't get easier than that. This is also a good time to taste it to see if it's seasoned properly before you give it a final bake. As with so many things on this menu, you can totally make this ahead of time and just top with cheese 30 minutes before serving. I'm not sure where the footage went for this, but I ended up pouring the pumpkin filling into the pie crust and placing that back into the oven for around 45 minutes. But while we're waiting for that to bake, we can make the pecan topping for the pumpkin pie. You should have some leftover egg whites from earlier. Combine with some sugar and salt and begin whisking until it slightly begins to froth. Feel free to also roast off your pecans in the oven since the oven is on anyways, and take them out, allow them to cool slightly, then combine with the egg white mixture. Again, set this aside until later on. I was also able to make the mushroom sauce for the bean casserole while waiting for everything to bake. Once again, I used the same pot that I used to make the bechamel sauce because it just cuts down on all of the dishes that you have to do, and the base is pretty much the same. You'll just want to melt down a knob of butter, toss in 2 to 3 tablespoons of that garlic that you prepared earlier, and most of the mushrooms. Once the liquid and the mushrooms have more or less cooked out, add in around 2 tablespoons of flour. Give that a good mix and let that cook off for a while. At this point, I recommend adding broth or water. Make sure to season it properly if you do choose to use water. The final step is just to add some heavy cream and allow that to cook down until it thickens. So around 40 minutes, you want to check in on your pumpkin pie, and in order to check if it's ready or not, you can jiggle it a little bit, and if it jiggles in the middle, then it's almost ready. Take your pecan topping and drain off most of the egg whites before putting it onto the pie. How you place the pecans is totally up to you. Use your creativity. Whole pecans are pretty, but they do make cutting harder later on, so just keep that in mind. Finish that off in the oven for around 10 minutes. That all took around 4 hours, and so the next day we're starting off fresh by preparing some apple pie filling. Depending on the size of apple you have, you'll need anywhere from 6 to 12 apples, so just keep that in mind, though I always think it's better to make more filling than less because you can always use it on oatmeal or something later on. Go ahead and peel those apples for a more tender filling. Next, you'll just want to cut off the tough bits of the apple, so cut it in half, then cut off the stem and the butt. Also make sure to get the seeds. Then just dice the apple into uniform pieces. I like to use the pie form to estimate how much apple I need. Remember that these apples will cook down, so you will need more than you think you do. This recipe uses a pre-cooked apple filling, which not only guarantees that your apples will be cooked, but you can also season it properly beforehand. Put all of your cut apples into a pan, squeeze some lemon on top, put some sugar, a drizzle of maple syrup, and then a knob of butter. Remember to also add the spices at this stage. Give that a good mix and leave it on the stove on a medium heat to cook down. You can use this time to take out the pie crust and roll it out into the pie form. Since we're topping the pie with a lattice crust, divide the dough in half and refrigerate half of it for now. The other half will be rolled out to form the base, which will also need to be refrigerated for at least 30 minutes after you roll it out. Taste your apples to see if it's the consistency you like. Make sure not to overcook it because then it will turn into a puree. Transfer it to a flat surface to cool. Take the other half of your dough out and roll it out into a circle just like you did the first half. Once it's at your desired thickness, go ahead and cut the dough into equal-sized strands. The more uniform your strands, the prettier your lattice will be, so just keep that in mind. When your filling has completely cooled, you can transfer that into the base layer of your dough. Place the strands vertically on top of the filling for the lattice. Make sure they're an equal distance from one another. Next, fold up every other strand, so in this case the first, the third, and the fifth one, and then place a strand horizontally underneath those folds. Then fold up the other one, so the second one and the fourth one, and then place another strand horizontally. Keep doing this until you've covered the entire pie. Make sure the edges of the lattice top meet the base, then cut off the excess dough. Give the pan you were using earlier a quick rinse, and now we're ready to make the stuffing sauce. The recipe I was looking at called for 3/4 cup of butter, which I thought was too much, so I just put in this big knob. Then add in some celery and lots of onion, and allow that to cook down. Pour that mixture into that bread that you toasted off in your oven yesterday, and give it all a good mix. Now, most crucially, you want to add in chopped herbs. I added in rosemary, thyme, sage, and parsley. And don't be afraid to be generous with these. Then you'll want to add around half of the broth that the recipe requires. Pour it in the container and let the flavors marinate. Let's prep the potatoes. I feel like these potatoes look more impressive than they actually are because they're essentially a baked potato filled with mashed potato. And so what you want to do is just cut out a circle on the top of the potato and hollow that out. Try to make the hole as big as possible without breaking the potato. Then grab a tiny spoon and dig out all of the flesh of the potato. Once you've done all that, go ahead and mash the filling. Being able to season the inside is what makes this so much better than actual baked potatoes. So you want to add some milk, some salt, pepper, garlic powder, paprika, or anything that you want, really. When you're satisfied with how it tastes, go ahead and refill those potato skins. I don't like to pack it down too tightly because I think the ridges on the top look really pretty, and they also end up crisping up in the oven when we put them back in. Now go ahead and put these potatoes on the baking sheet as prep. Remember those Brussels sprouts that we salted earlier? You can take them out, drain them, and pour them into this bowl. Drizzle some olive oil on top, season with salt and pepper, then add in bits of bacon. This really adds so much depth to the Brussels sprouts and makes them so delicious right out of the oven. They actually take the same amount of time to cook as the potatoes, so putting them on the same sheet doesn't hurt. Alright, we're starting to assemble the final elements. Take those blanched green beans and that sauce that you made earlier and pour them into this bowl again. Make sure that every single bean is covered by this sauce. Place it back into the tray and it's ready to bake. I bought store-bought roasted onions to top it later on, but at this stage you could also add breadcrumbs or cheese or whatever you want. The mac and cheese also just needs one more element to prepare before baking. Of course, it's the shredded cheese. I actually prefer to put more cheese on top and less inside because I like that ratio, but of course you could have added more cheese earlier on in the bechamel and less cheese on top. Then put it in the oven with all of the rest of the stuff you prepared for around 20 minutes. I haven't really talked about the duck until now, but basically it was just defrosting overnight. All you have to do is just season with salt. I patted it dry first to make sure it wasn't holding on to too much moisture. And then I put it into the tray with all of the veggies and sprinkled liberally with salt. People always say that this is the centerpiece, but to me, Thanksgiving is more about the sides, and I don't really care as much about the meat, especially if the meat is turkey. I know it's controversial, but I hate turkey. I think it's way too dry. Duck is way easier to cook because there's so much fat in the duck that it just holds on to all of the juices, and the success rate of cooking duck is also much, much better. Stuff it with sage, garlic, and lemon, then put it breast side down into the oven for 40 minutes, then flip for another 40 minutes. For a refreshing drink to break up all of these heavy foods, I thought a lychee grapefruit spritzer would be perfect. All you need is some grapefruit juice, some lychee juice from a can of lychees, a squeeze of lemon, some sugar, and some ice. Add sparkling water for a non-alcoholic version or champagne for an alcoholic version. I think this would also be a really good mixer for hard liquor. I added 2 lychees to some martini glasses, poured in this juice, and then topped it off with champagne. One by one, everything should start coming together. I'm always surprised at how well this turns out. The duck skin was so crispy and it was just cooked beautifully. Everything was glistening in the afternoon light and it looked so beautiful. We were so ready to feast. I hope you try this out and thanks for watching. Bye!